Alice Ann Arvin King.
What year were you born?
In 1941, San Antonio, Texas, in the Nix Hospital.
What did your parents say about the day you were born?
I don't know. I guess they were glad I was alive and had all my fingers and toes.
Were you named for anyone?
Well, my mother's first name was Alice, and I guess that's why I got the Alice. And one of her aunts was named Alice. She wanted to name me Olivia after her, but Daddy didn't want to, so.
Was there ever a meaning to your family name?
It goes way, way back, but it's Arvin or Irvin or Irwin. But I haven't found anything. There's a lot of John Arvins and a lot of Carlyles and a lot of John Carlyle, and that's my father's name, and John Christopher.
Did the family name change?
Yes, it's spelled with an I-R or an E-R or an A-R. Irwin, Arwin, Irwin. You find it changed, and it's obvious from the names of the people and other things that it's the same family.
Were there any stories about the changes?
There's one, I can't remember the exact story, but the man didn't particularly like the family that he moved away from, so he changed his name a little bit, so it wouldn't appear that he came from that family. But the children's birthdays were all the same as from the from where he moved away from, so everybody knew who he was.
Was there a major event that happened the year that you were born?
In 1941, I think there was a war. I think they started a war that year. I think there was a pretty big major event that year.
What was your earliest memory?
I remember when I went hunting Easter eggs in the yard, and there were a lot of Easter eggs. And we had a beautiful yard. My mother was a gardener, and she had rose bushes. She had over 100 rose bushes all around the house. We had orange trees in the yard and just a lot of places to hide eggs. And a lot of my friends were there helping me look for eggs, and they ran way ahead looking for eggs, and I was slow, and I very methodically was looking for eggs. And they would pass them up, and I found a lot of eggs. I had my whole basket full. And they were up there looking for them, and they couldn't find any, and they looked back at me, and my basket was full, and I was so glad. I was pretty little. I could hardly hold the basket. Yes. In the Episcopal Church. And I went to the Episcopal Church while I was growing up, and if I go, that's where I go now. There's one in Devine, and there's several in San Antonio. Yes, And that was I'm pretty sure it was in Kingsville, or Harlingen. I'm not sure. Yes. When I was very young, I had measles. They kept me at home for 10 days. I was red all over, and they kept the blinds closed. I couldn't go outside. I couldn't see anything. They put an IV in me, and the doctor came to visit me, and it was a long time before it was over 10 days. It must have been some kind of measles that lasted a long time. They told me it was white Coca-Cola in that bottle that was dripping into my arm. This is Olivia Shaw Arvin. She's the daughter of John Shaw, and she was born in 1907. She taught school for about 36 years, I believe. Okay. Her name was Alice Olivia Shaw. Her mother married John Shaw. Her brother was Don Francis Shaw, and her sister was Ethel Bernice Shaw. They were real close together. She went to school, to elementary school in Somerset until she was about 9 years old. And then her mother sent her to, or her parents sent her to boarding school in San Antonio. It was called Westmoreland. It was a girls' school. Mother went to school in San Antonio at Westmoreland, and then she went to San Marcos and got her teacher's certificate at San Marcos.
This is Ann King. I'm reading a letter to my mother from a Mr. Walker, who was looking for a person to teach the children on his ranch. August the 30th, 1925. Miss Olivia Shaw, Somerset, Texas. Dear Miss Shaw, your letter to hand and note what you say as to experience in teaching. If agree with you, it's true that with sheer determination, one can make a success of almost any undertaking. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to see what you can do with teaching Mexicans. We will want the school to start October the 1st. We'll advise you later as to exact date. So write me if I can depend upon you. I will be here for next 10 days.
And she got her job on the Walker Ranch. That some of them didn't speak English, but Mother could speak Spanish. She started teaching at a one-room schoolhouse. When Mother would go, there were only 12 children would come, and most of them were older boys. And once the families found out that Mother would make them mind, and that she wouldn't let them cuss or, use any bad words or misbehave, then they started sending the younger children and the girls. First, there were no girls and no younger children, and when they found out that she wouldn't let them misbehave, they started sending the younger children and the girls. And before long, she had 60 children, not 12, but 60, in a one-room schoolhouse. And then it started getting cold. She said they had wood there and a wood stove. And she would get there about 6 o'clock in the morning, and she'd start the fire. And still it'd take time to warm up the wooden schoolhouse. And then all of a sudden somebody would come and the fire would be lit and it'd be warm by the time she got there. Well, she went there real early one morning and waited in the bushes to find out who it was, and she found it was one of her students. One of the older boys was coming real early, about 5 o'clock, and he was setting the fire, and she said it was one of them that gave her the most trouble. But he would set that fire every morning. And then he'd go hide somewhere and come with the rest of the kids. She bought a car. She had bought one of those kind that you wind up in the front. You have to get out and wind it up to start it. And she worked at the Walker Ranch outside of Divine, and they also had one outside of Luling. She went back and forth on her car, back and forth to Somerset. And a good story was that one time there was a ditch alongside the road, and a horse jumped over the ditch and right in front of her, and she hit it and killed it. And she was so afraid she was going to have to pay for that horse. And what was she going to do if she had to pay for the horse? Anyway, she went on. She moved it out of the way, and she went on down the road. And on the way back, when she was going home, she stopped at this filling station and got to get gas to go home. And this man he was putting gas in, and he wiped some stuff off her bumper, and he said, "Horsehair." He looked on his hand, he said, "Horsehair, you're the one that killed that horse." He said, "Wasn't old Mr. So-and-so? He's been bragging all week that he killed that horse." There was a man that was drunk, evidently, and it hit the horse again and thought he killed it. He said he'd been bragging all week. He says, "You just go right on home and don't you tell anybody that you hit that horse." So she didn't have to pay for the horse. I have a gift that they gave my parents when they got married. It's a gold sugar and creamer. It's china, but it's gold on the outside. Mother and Aunt Ethel were in class in school at Southwest Texas State Teachers College in San Marcos at the same time that Lyndon Johnson was in school there. And Aunt Ethel and I believe Mother were both in chemistry class with him. Well, they liked him. He had a good personality, you know. They liked him a lot. They said he was fun to be around. And then her mother got sick with colon cancer, and she went home and took care of her mother till she died. She had to quit teaching school to do that. And when her mother died, then she went to live with her brother, Don Shaw. Now, Don had gone to A&M and got his degree in engineering. Just right when he graduated, he went into the military, into the war. He was barely 21 years old, or not quite 21, and they took him in, and he couldn't even be an officer yet. He was supposed to be because he had gone through all the training, but he wasn't quite old enough to be one. And the first thing this general asked him, he said, "You have a degree in petroleum engineering." He said, "And we're not able to get the gasoline, the petroleum, to the troops in Africa." He said, "We have a long pipeline, and we put the oil in, and nothing comes out the end." And he said, "Can you do anything about it, or do you know what to do?" And my Uncle Don said, "Well, of course I know what to do." He said, "If you'll give me the power to do it, I can do it." And he was this young kid, was not even 21 yet. And the general said, "Okay, you just do whatever you want to do." And so first thing he did was he went to the employment office, and he said, "I want every man that's out there working that has ever worked on any kind of oil, pipeline or oil field or anywhere in the oil field." And he said, "I want to know who they are, and if they're anywhere in that area, I want them on the pipeline." And he said, "They are to be the boss of 4 men on a group." And these groups of 4 or 5 men with one person that's the boss, and the boss has to have worked on a pipeline or in an oil field. And they put them out there, and they went all over the whole pipeline, and pretty soon they had it to where it wasn't leaking. Didn't take them long. They got it all fixed up. He just got people that knew what they were doing out there working. And here he was, barely 21 years old. He was in until the war was over. He went to work for Humble Oil. Mother went and lived with him in Kelsey, Bass, which was in Duval County, which is out in the middle of nowhere in South Texas. And they had these houses that the company owned that the people lived in that worked out there. And my daddy worked in the office, and my daddy was an accountant, and he lived in the house next door to Uncle Don.
And your dad?
John Carlisle Arvin. And Daddy was a bachelor. He was 40-something years old. He was quite a bit older than my mother. And she was still in her 20s, and or 28 or 29, I think. She started cooking for him, and because he'd come home with Uncle Don, and she'd end up cooking for both of them. And she'd find meat in the refrigerator, and she'd cook it. Because my father was a hunter, and he'd go out and hunt something, and he'd leave it in her refrigerator. And one time she found these birds in the refrigerator, and they had blue necks on them. Their necks were all blue, and she didn't know what they were. So she fried them. She thought it was some kind of dove or something. And he came in and he said, "Frying them?" And she said, "Yes." And he didn't say anything. They went on and ate them, and they were pretty good. Well, it turns out there were those blue-necked ducks. And I guess you don't fry ducks. And you're supposed to bake them or something else. The ducks are, I don't know, pretty bad to, you have to do something to make them not taste bad. But Mama said they were pretty good fried. He didn't complain. She cooked them. But anyway, they ended up getting married. And that's how she met him.
So what?
She was born in '07, and Aunt Ethel was born in '10, and Uncle Don was born in '12. And Aunt Ethel had one child, so I'm an only child. John Lyle was an only child. And Uncle Don had 3 boys, Milton, David, and Michael. We have 5, cousins between us. was 46 years old when he died of colon cancer. Same thing his mother died of. He was very young. He had 3 sons, and they were 9, 6, and 4 when he died. David Shaw was down swimming and fishing down on the creek on the Guadalupe, where his mother bought a house and a creek bank piece of property. It was out in the brush, and David had parked away from the creek, but he had walked in, and he was walking around doing what, and he was going fishing, I guess. And he went to get in there, and he got bitten by a copperhead. Well, he had sense enough to bring the snake with him. And I don't know what he did to the bite, but he probably tied off his leg. And he walked out. He had quite a ways to walk. And walked to the car, brought the snake with him, and got to a hospital. But it was very serious, and they said if he hadn't brought the snake with him, and so they could get the right antivenom, that he might have died, because it was very serious. And Milton is an MD. He's in Blanco now, but he works at the VA hospital in Kerrville. David is a real estate man in Houston. And Michael is in Tennessee, and he's an architect. They all have done very well.
So your
He was born in 1892 in Missouri, in Roanoke, Missouri. And my father was an accountant. They tried to draft him for World War II, but I think he was too old. And so they didn't. I had a pretty good life. My daddy worked for Humble Oil, and he had a pretty steady job. And right before he retired, a lot of the people that worked for Humble Oil came from New York. Some of the big people that were high up in the company wanted to go hunting, and they came to go hunting with my father because they knew that he would kill a deer for them if they couldn't kill one. Because he was really good and he had a reputation. And he took them hunting on the King Ranch, and they got their deer. My father would go down to the coast, and he bought a big boat one time, and he would get a friend to go with him. And that boat lasted about a month. And he discovered that he had to clean that boat when he finished going fishing. And he decided that he would rather go with his friend and let his friend clean the boat. But he would go, and if he didn't catch any fish, he would buy them with a silver hook, or what he called a silver hook. And he always came home with fish.
So what was a silver hook?
It was money. When he died, he had 7 rent houses in Corpus that he bought during the Depression. He bought them before he married Mother, and he had them for years. And he bought one in San Antonio, a 2-story one over there by Fort Sam, and he sold it just before I went to college. And he sold it to some people that were living in the bottom of it, and they rented out the top of it. He had the top rented and the bottom rented. And he sold it to the people in the bottom, and they were using the rent from the top to pay the payments on it. And they had put a pretty good down payment on it. And that's what I used to go to college. And he died about 2 weeks before I went to college. And he had put I had all my clothes packed in a trunk to go on the train. He had taken the trunk to the railway station. My ticket was already paid for. All my money was in the bank. All my tuition was paid. That money was coming into the bank account to pay, for extra stuff that I needed. Everything was taken care of, and he died. I had a very, very good father and good mother also. I'm very fortunate. But I remember when Daddy's funeral happened that, nobody expected it. He was perfectly healthy. Died the year after he retired. We lived in Harlingen, and when Dad died, she didn't even think about bringing him to Somerset. It was such a surprise, and she buried him in Harlingen. We should have brought him up to Somerset, or at least San Antonio. I was going to Stevens College in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, my first year, which was very close to his family home in Roanoke, Missouri. And I asked Mother if she wanted me to stay home, and she said no. She said, you have to go to college, and I have to teach school, and you might as well go. He would not want you to stay home. And you might, and so I went. And after I came back the first year, I wanted to come home, and I had always wanted to go to the University of Texas in Austin. So I didn't stay the second year there. It was a 2-year school at the time. So I went on home, and I went to the University of Texas my second year. And I graduated from the University of Texas in 1962. And he had 2 brothers, and they were twins. They were not identical. They were fraternal twins. And they were younger than he was, about 3 or 4 years younger than he was. He had a sister that was older, Lillian. When he was 10, the boys were 5. The boys' names were Raymond and Edmund. Raymond was in the Navy, and he used to invent things all the time. He would spend all his money buying little screws and little things, and he would put things together, and he was going to make $1 million inventing things. And he worked for the Navy, and he ended up doing things that were top secret for the Navy, and nobody knew what he did. And he would spend all his money buying little things, and finally the Navy had to send his money to his wife because they had 3 children and they needed money to feed the children. He had a pretty good job with the Navy, but nobody knew what it was.
How long was he in the Navy?
Till he retired. Well, no, he didn't retire. He died at work. He was almost ready to retire. He died. He had a heart attack and put his head down on the desk and died. Nobody was expecting it. The other twin lived to be 89 years old, and he had 3 insurance offices. He got one till it was real big. He sold it and made $1 million on it, back when $1 million was a lot of money. And then he started another one, built it up real big, sold it, made a lot of money on it. And then he started another one, built it up, made a lot of money on it. And he had 1 child, an only child. His son was Edmund Arvin also. Last one was John Clark Arvin. He's an ornithologist, and he didn't have any children. His sister, she was sick, and she was in the hospital for a long time. And I couldn't understand how anybody could speak perfect English and not do any better than she did. I don't know. She had brain damage when she was born. Her memory wasn't real good. I lived till I was 11 in Kingsville, and he worked on the King Ranch out there for Exxon, or for Humboldt. It was not changed to Exxon at that time. It was still Humboldt Oil. He worked for the oil coming off the King Ranch.
So what did your mother do then?
She didn't teach while we lived in Kingsville. She did a lot of community service, and she worked they built a library, and they built a women's club thing. She worked for the women's club, and she worked for the garden club, and she worked at the Episcopal Church thing. And at Christmas they had the garden club. It was a benefit, I think, for the library. I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I can't remember everything, but they had a big party at the big house on the King Ranch. And have you ever seen the movie Giant? Okay, you know the house.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's the inside of it is just like the big house on the King Ranch. You know how huge it is and all those balconies and stuff. Okay, they decorated the whole house with Christmas decorations. The garden club did. I mean, it was gorgeous. All the women had decorations. Well, my mother had, you've seen these little wrought iron Christmas trees with the little candles on them. Well, Mother had about 10 of them, and big ones graduated down to small ones. And she had 2 tables about this size with these things, or at least one. I don't know. It was a big table, but it was a lot of them. And she decorated them with poinsettias and red candles. And it was gorgeous. And people would come by, and when the candles would melt down, she would set them down here and put new candles. People would pick up those old candles and take them with them as souvenirs. She ran out of candles. She had lots of candles, boxes of them, and then she ran out. And she told me, she says, you go get Daddy and see if he can get Mr. Frost, I think that was his name, that had the hardware store, and see if he can go get us some more candles. We're out of candles. I ran and found Daddy. And he went and he called up Mr. Frost. He may have had, we tracked Mr. Frost down that owned the hardware store. And we went and got boxes of candles, those little red candles, and we brought them back in. And it was supposed to be over at 9 o'clock, and it was 12 o'clock before the people were lined up out down the road. You've never seen so many people in your life. And they were paying like $10 or $15 a head just to go in there and see it. You've never seen so many people. Poinsettias would wilt because of all the candles. And Mama would get the wilted ones. I would take them to the bathtub. We would put them in water so they would revive. And we'd bring them back, and the ones that had revived, and put them out for the display. And so we had 2 whole tables full of poinsettias, and we'd put them back, and then we'd bring the ones that revived and put them back on the table, and the wilted ones we'd put back in the bathtub. So we worked the whole day, whole afternoon and night, removing the poinsettias and putting new ones back, because they would die from the heat. It was work. And there were people coming in and coming in and coming in. And it really was good for whatever it was, they were making the money for. But it was beautiful. All the things, all the arrangements that people made were gorgeous. Not just ours. Of course, I thought ours was wonderful, but everybody else was too. And at that time, they had one of the men that had sued the ranch and got part of the property from the ranch that was the son of a native from the Virgin Islands that had come back and sued for his share of the ranch and got it. And he didn't think that the oil company was giving him his share of the oil money. And Daddy was a really good bookkeeper, and he would show him how he was doing the books, and how the oil was coming in and how it was being divided up. And Daddy was the only one that he could get along with, because Daddy would explain to him how the oil was coming in, how much was coming in, how much they were getting paid for it, how much they would sell it and how much was being paid and how much his interest was. And he could get along with him, and a lot of the rest of them could not get along with him. He was a lawyer, but he was difficult to get along with, and his interest was down there close to Raymondville. And they asked Daddy if he only had 5 years to go before he retired. And they asked him if he would move down there and take care of that part of it until he retired, and he said he would. So we moved down there. Her name is Ethel Bernice Shaw. She went to teach school in Campbellton, and she married Lytle Tom from Campbellton. They had one child, John Lytle, Tom, my cousin. And he had 4 children, my cousins, and has two boys, and yeah, he has two children, two boys. It's hard to keep up with everybody. But Aunt Ethel was very close to me after my mother died. And was, she was my extra mother. When Aunt Ethel was in college at San Marcos, she was the queen of San Marcos. She was in the parade. She was in a lot of, what do you call them, dances that they had, big celebrations that they had. She was the queen of all of it. And she was very beautiful. And it was very exciting at that time. I was talking to her about when she grew up. And when she married Uncle Lionel, she lived out on a ranch, and they had no electricity. See, my mother, she lived on that humble camp with my daddy, and they had everything that there was to have because the company provided it. But Aunt Ethel lived on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, and they had no electricity. The water came off the roof and went into a cistern. Most of it came off the roof, and they had no electricity. Her husband, Lytle Tom, was one of the instigators of the rural electricity that was put in, but that was in 1939. And so she lived out there for a long time with no electricity. They had cattle and they had horses, they had chickens, and they probably had hogs too. But she said they milked the cows for milk, and they used the milk to feed the chickens. And she said, oh, the best chicken you ever want to eat is one fed with milk. She said, you can't hardly get a chicken today that's going to be as tasty as one fed with milk. They're not anywhere as near as good. So if you're going to grow chickens and you want them to taste good, you feed them milk. My suggestion is if you're going to grow chickens and you want to eat them, feed them milk. There was uranium discovered down close to Aunt Ethel and Uncle Idle's ranch. And Uncle Idle and Aunt Ethel had signed a lease for drilling for minerals, and it included uranium. But they were thinking oil. Then these people next to them, 20 miles away, not too far, sold leases for uranium, and they found uranium, and they were digging big holes in the ground. And the holes were 15 miles long. And they were piling up dirt, and the holes were a mile or two wide. And they were piling big piles of dirt on the side. And they had a lake going there. And the neighbors were thinking, oh man, we've got a lake we can swim in, and we can ride boats and things. But the lake was radioactive. I don't know what has happened to it since. Uranium has sort of bottomed out. They didn't get enough out of it to make it worthwhile to dig anymore. All right, when Mother would go to see Grandfather, which was at least once a month, she would take Aunt Tot food and check on her, make sure she was okay. One time that she went, Aunt Tot told her that if she would try to buy the heirs' property, she would will her property. That if she would move to San Antonio and take care of her till she died, she would will her property. Riley. And she lived there in that house next to my house, on the property there. She's the one that gave her property to Mother. Mother lived down in Harlingen, and all her family lived close to Somerset. So she thought she'd try to do that. And she got a lawyer, and the lawyer started contacting the heirs, and he offered the heirs to the property. I think it was approximately the amount that the tax appraisal was. Mother took care of it, and she went by the laws of the state of Texas, and she divided it up according to the rules of the state of Texas, which was the amount of people that it would be divided up among that were her heirs. And Mother came to San Antonio, and she looked for a job. Well, she was 50 years old at the time. And it's hard for a woman that's 50 years old to get a job, She was a school teacher and had been teaching 20 years, and she had, in Texas, the longer you teach, the more money you make. And the schools don't want to hire somebody that they have to pay more. If they have a lot of time in, they have to pay them more. She went to the North Side School District because they let you teach till you're 70. And she just kept going every weekend until she finally got a job with North Side School District. It was right before school started, and they needed a teacher real bad, and they hadn't been able to find anybody else. And they gave her a job teaching 5th grade. And she taught math, mainly math, in the 5th grade until she retired there. She really enjoyed it. She was a very good teacher. And she moved to San Antonio for the job. And Miss Reeder, that lived next door, called Mother, and she said, there's a hurricane coming in. I've got a Allied van line out front. They've loaded all my furniture, and they have room for your furniture. Do you want them to take it? Mother said, take it. Please take it. The storm was coming in. They were flooding everywhere. It was raining cats and dogs. It was flooding all over the valley, down in the the lower Rio Grande Valley, the Valley Morning Star had built a brand new plant for the newspaper, and it was on the Arroyo Colorado, which was a big waterway not too far from our home. And do you know that it flooded the whole thing? And it wasn't 6 months old. And we all cried and cried because it was gone. And our whole subdivision was supposed to flood, and it did. Our house, Ms. Reeder's house, and the one across from the street from Ms. Reeder's house were the only 3 houses in our subdivision that did not flood. The water came all the way up to the front step of our front porch. It came within 3 inches of coming in the house. And Mother had a house full of antiques, and they would have been ruined, all of them. But Miss Reeder loaded it all up. I mean, we had garbage cans full of garbage that made it all the way to San Antonio. Full of garbage, but that's all right. Mama paid them and was glad to get her garbage. Mother had a really nice apartment. It was a whole top story of one of those great big old 2-story houses in Alamo Heights. And it filled up the whole top of that house. But she was really glad to have her furniture. And that's how she got everything moved to San Antonio. My Aunt Ethel, when she paid for the one for Granddad and for Mother, she also paid for one for me, so that I would have a place by my mother when I chose to die. She died in 1983, and she was sick for about a year ahead of time. She had colon cancer, which her mother had colon cancer and died, and her brother died of colon cancer. And his wasn't exactly colon, it was a little higher up on the digestive tract, but basically it was similar. She was at home. We lived in San Antonio on Trafalgar Street, and she was at home. She was very ill. She had been in and out of the hospital. She just got to the point where she just stayed at home. And we finally got hospice, but only a couple of days before she died, and not soon enough to do much good. The Catholic Church helped us as much or more than anybody, and that wasn't soon enough to do a whole lot of good, but a nun came and helped me get some insurance stuff done that I didn't know would help. It would have helped if I'd had that sooner. This is John Francis Shaw. He was born in 1872 and died in 1960. He was my grandfather. My mother and I used to come about twice a month from Kingsville to visit Granddad and sort of keep the house clean. And when we would go to take food and to Granddad and take care of him, we would fill his freezer with TV dinners that Mother had made. When she would cook for us at home, she would make enough for, instead of just for the 3 of us, she'd make for 4. She'd make enough for Granddad, and she'd make a TV dinner for him. And she had these little trays, and she'd make them for Granddad and put them in the freezer. And then we'd take them up there and put them in his freezer. We would come and bring them back every 2 weeks. We'd replenish the freezer. There was a lady next door, Miss Nixon, that took care of him, that checked him and cooked for him, and they lived next door in that other little house that's still there on the property, and I think they paid $6 a month rent for it, and they were just a really nice family. The Nixons were. They had a daughter named Patricia, when I outgrew my clothes, my mother would give them to her. I always wondered where they went, when I was growing up. And I never found out until she came and talked to me one time as an adult, and she told me that she, and thanked me for all the things that Mother had given her. And she said she still had a little bracelet that had a little silver bracelet that had hearts on it. And I thought I had lost it. But my mother gave it to her. I guess I wasn't wearing it, and Mother just passed it on. During the war, when they were interning the Japanese, close to the Old Rock Church in the neighborhood there in Old Somerset, there was a man called Lombardi, or a family there, that lived very close to where my grandfather lived. My grandfather knew him very well, knew the family. Everybody would go and buy wine from him. And he was one of them that they took and put him in jail, or whatever they did with him.
Internment camp?
In one of those internment camps. And he was a good person. He had been there for years and years. And
Did he have a shortwave radio?
I think so. And he had family, I guess he tried to talk to. But he wasn't doing anything bad. And everybody was horrified they took him away. And he came back after the war, he came back for a little while, but he didn't stay. And my grandfather was very upset when they took him. He died when I just had gotten out of high school. My father died, then my Uncle Don died, and then my grandfather died, all within 2 years, which was really hard on the family. He was old, by the time that I was big enough to know him. He was already old. He was 89 when he died. And he would get up in the morning and he would put on a white shirt. He had to have a white shirt, a suit, and the suit had to have a vest that matched the suit. It had to be the same material. And he had a pocket watch that went in the suit. He would, at 6 o'clock in the morning, he would go and sit at the front. There was a table by the front door, and it had a radio on it. And he would sit and listen to the 6 o'clock news, all in his suit and white shirt and tie. And he did that every day. And when it got to the point where vests were out of style, Mother had to have a suit made for him at one of these tailor places where they make suits, which was very expensive, for us, because you couldn't go buy a suit with a vest that matched. No, they didn't make them. And I can remember Mother taking him to a tailor and getting him a new suit, and it matched. And he was very proud of that suit, and he wore it every day. And she had to get 2 or 3 pair of pants for it, I think, to go with it, so it lasted longer. But even when he was old, he never got sloppy. He never wore lounging clothes or blue jeans or anything like that. He had to have his suit and his white shirt and his vest and his watch. from Somerset, Bear, September the 12th, 1893. To the Editor Monitor, I see by your issue of the 1st instant that you solicit correspondence from the different parts of the county, so I thought that I would comply with your request. The farmers are all busy with their cotton and corn crops at present, the former yielding about 1/3 of a bale to the acre and the latter about 30 bushels. Mr. George Carruthers has just returned from the World's Fair and is contemplating a bored well on his place. Also offers $1,000 for a flow of artesian water on his place at Somerset. Miss Ella Johnson of San Antonio, a graduate of the Sam Houston Normal Institute at Huntsville, who has taught several schools in this vicinity, has been engaged to teach the Somerset School. The Mexicans in this vicinity are preparing for the 16th. We are needing rain badly. If it doesn't come within 2 weeks, the people will have to move their stock. The gin at Somerset has ginned 125 bales so far, and one at Bear, which runs day and night, 359 bales. Hoping that this will be satisfactory, I remain, yours respectfully, John F. Shaw. The house that my grandfather John Shaw lived in was built by Harris Oppenheimer in 1873. He was married to Olivia Jasper. His family were business people. They were bankers and had owned businesses. I think his father had a big, well, he was a merchant. He bought and sold things. Harris built the house, and when they redid the front porch, some of the wood on it had been brought from East Texas. It had information on it that it had been brought from East Texas. And that's a long way to bring wood, back in 1873. There's a concrete porch now, so. It has 2 front doors that are 9 feet tall. It still has original doors. The windows are really tall, And when I tried to get new windows put in, I would have to have individual windows made to put in because they're such an odd, they're really tall and thin, and they're not like normal everyday windows that they make now. The ceilings inside are 14 feet in the main part. There was a fireplace in it that I've had to seal off because it cracked and caused a fire. It's set on a rock foundation, a rock that's cemented together and is slightly crooked. It was added on to in 1940. There's an addition in the back to it. Harris and Olivia had a store, a general store, there next to the house, and they sold everything that you needed out in the country. They sold all stuff needed for horses, all kinds of horse tack. They sold feed for cattle feed and horse feed. They sold butane. They sold sewing supplies. My mother remembered as a child, she remembered the store when she was little, and she was born in 1907. She said they had 5 sewing machines in that store. She thought that was a lot of sewing machines, and she was very impressed with the 5 sewing machines. They sold farm equipment, and they sold all kinds of equipment to go with them. They sold screws, they sold nails, they sold a lot of things like that you use, that you need. And it was a fairly large, I think it was 2-story store, and had a lot of stuff in it. And they had a butane stove in the middle of it that got built up pressure and exploded and burned it all down. Now, this happened when my mother was a child. She remembered it happening, and I don't know, I know the exact year, but she had to be old, she was 1907, so she had to be old enough to remember it. So I would say it would be at least 1910 or 15, that she had to be old enough to remember it. And they didn't have any insurance on it, so they didn't replace it. I believe it was right next door to the left of the house. I've always thought it was, but then somebody told me that there was something behind the house, way behind, and some people that had information about the church over there, and they thought it was behind the house, and I don't know. I've always thought it was right next to the house.
And then how far was the church from the house?
The church is down the road about, quarter of a mile down the road. He was in Mexico, and he got rheumatism so bad that he could not walk, and he was in a wheelchair. He was in Mexico selling farm machinery. He went to a doctor in Mexico, and the doctor told him to get bees and let them sting him, and that would possibly get rid of the rheumatism. He said he didn't guarantee it, but it was a possibility. And so Ed came home in a wheelchair, all the way from the middle of Mexico. He came home on a train, and then, I don't know how he got home, but he got home. And he got bees, and he let them sting him, and he lived to be I think, 89 years old, and he never was crippled. He never had any more rheumatism. I know he must have had the gout because Mother would bring him T-bone steaks, and he wouldn't eat them. He said he couldn't eat that much meat. And I think he knew that he had to control how much protein he ate. So maybe he also had the gout. But he never was crippled again, not after the bees stung him. I can remember when he had honeybees. When I was very young, he had honeybees. And at that time, he had so many honeybees, and he was bringing so much honey in that he had this giant centrifuge. And it was taller than I was. And of course, I was a little kid. It must have been at least 6 feet tall. And it was a big centrifuge to put honey in to get the honey out of the wax. Must have had a lot of bees to use anything that big. I don't remember seeing that many bees, but I guess you don't see the bees. You know, he must have had them, you know, out on the place somewhere. But they didn't beat. After he first started working with them, and they bit him a lot, he got over the rheumatism, and they didn't bite him after that. I don't think they thought he was a bee because he must have smelled like a bee. I guess, I don't know. My grandfather, John Shaw, was stuck in, evidently, he was coming home from somewhere, and it had been raining a lot, and the roads were real muddy, and he got stuck in the mud. And he would not let anybody pull him out except just one person. He wanted to pull him out. And when the man finally came and pulled him out, but evidently he had tried to push himself out by himself, and he had fallen and got mud all over his coat. And he was found the next day dead in his bed. And that's probably what killed him.